poor sick woman sells her paintings to pay for chemo, until a mafia boss stops and changes her life. The crowd moved like a tide of indifference, brushing past her as if she were invisible. She stood at the corner of the busy street, trembling slightly, holding out the last of her paintings, her hands pale, her breath shallow from the sickness gnawing at her inside. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak over the noise, offering them her art, begging them to look just once. No one did. It didn't even glance. One man waved her off like she was trash. Another brushed against her shoulder, so hard she nearly fell, the canvas slipping from her hand and landing face down in a puddle. She bent to pick it up, coughing, clutching her chest. The world didn't pause. It never did for people like her. That's when the laughter came, sharp, cruel, from a group of rich men at the cafe nearby. One of them pointed at her, mocking the way she struggled to lift the soaked painting. He threw a coin toward her feet like she was a beggar, and the others laughed harder. The humiliation burned through her body, hot and bitter. She didn't want pity. She wanted someone to see her work, to know she existed. But to them, she was just noise on the sidewalk. Then the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, like the air itself held its breath. A car door slammed. The sound of leather shoes on pavement cut through the chatter of the street. Heads turned, and whispers started. His name, his presence, that shadow everyone knew but dared not speak too loudly about. The man who owned half the city's fear had just stepped out of a black car, eyes cold, jaw tight, suit pressed like he'd walked out of a world built on power and precision. The Mafia boss. He didn't say a word as he approached the group that had been laughing. His stare alone made them shrink back. One of them tried to speak, but his voice cracked mid-sentence. The boss's gaze drifted down to the woman crouched by the puddle, clutching her ruined painting to her chest like it was her last breath of life. The contrast between them was brutal, his world and hers colliding under the gray sky. Before we go further, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your city? And if this story already hit you in the gut, don't scroll past without subscribing. Trust me, what happens next, you'll never forget it. The woman didn't look up at first, too ashamed to meet his eyes. She expected more cruelty. But then a hand reached down, not to mock, not to push her away, but to lift the ruined painting from the puddle. His expensive watch gleamed as he held it up, water dripping from the edges of the canvas. He stared at it, silent, then at her. His expression didn't give anything away, but something shifted in the air. He asked her how much. She stammered, her throat tight, her body shaking too much to stand straight. He didn't wait for her answer. He took out a thick envelope, more cash than she had seen in her life, and placed it on the table beside her broken easel. He didn't buy one painting. He bought them all. The onlookers watched in disbelief. The same men who had mocked her earlier couldn't even speak. The woman tried to protest, whispering that it was too much, but he just looked at her with an expression that silenced her. It wasn't pity. It was something else. Recognition. A flicker of something human buried deep inside the armor of a man who'd seen too much darkness. He told his driver to take the paintings carefully, not to fold or stack them. The driver hesitated for a second, surprised by the unusual command, but obeyed. The Mafia boss turned back to her and asked her name. She whispered it, almost inaudible. He repeated it under his breath, testing how it sounded in his mouth, as if engraving it into his memory. Then, before she could thank him, he was gone. Just like that. She stood there, watching the car pull away, the envelope still lying on the table, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside, stacks of bills. Enough to pay for her chemo. Enough to live. She started crying, her body shaking uncontrollably. People began to stare again, but this time it wasn't out of cruelty. Some looked confused. Some looked guilty, but none of them moved to help her. The only one who had was already gone. That night, she didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the look in his eyes when he picked up her painting. He wasn't supposed to care. Men like him didn't. They took destroyed, ruled through fear. But he had stopped. He had seen her. She thought about the life she used to have before the sickness stripped everything away. before her friends disappeared, before her landlord stopped answering her calls, before the world turned its back on her because she was weak, broke, and dying. She thought about how one act of kindness from the most unlikely person had just changed everything. The next morning, she went to the hospital. For the first time in months, she didn't have to lie about the bills. She handed over cash and told them to start the treatment immediately. The nurses stared in surprise. When they asked where she got the money, she just smiled faintly and said a stranger bought her art. But the story didn't end there. Because that same morning, across the city, the Mafia boss sat in his office, holding one of her paintings. It was small, simple, an image of a girl sitting in the rain, reaching toward the light. His right-hand man asked if he should discard it, but he didn't answer. He just kept staring at it, jaw clenched, something burning behind his eyes. That painting reminded him of something, or someone, he'd buried long ago. That's when he gave a new order. He told his men to find her. Quietly. No threats, no intimidation. Just find her and report back. They looked at each other, confused. It wasn't like him to care, but when the boss spoke, they obeyed. And as they left, he poured himself a drink, still staring at the painting, whispering something to himself that no one else could hear. That night, she came home from the hospital, exhausted but alive. The world felt different, lighter. For the first time in so long, she allowed herself to smile. But when she turned on her light, something froze her blood cold. There, on her small table, was another envelope. No one had broken in. The door was locked. But the envelope sat there, neat, deliberate. Inside it, another stack of cash. And a note. It had only 3 words written in elegant handwriting that made her heart race. Keep painting. Always. She didn't know how he'd found her. She didn't know why he cared. But in that moment, she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because behind that note wasn't just money. It was a message. A connection. And somewhere across the city, the man who wrote it wasn't finished with her story. Because for the first time in years, something in him had come alive too. And neither of them knew it yet. But saving her might just be the thing that saved him. She stood frozen in her small apartment, the note trembling in her hand, the 3 words looping through her mind like a whisper she couldn't escape. Keep painting. Always. The letters looked as though they'd been written with intention, like the writer wasn't used to saying things softly, but had tried. Her heartbeat was so loud, she could barely hear her own thoughts. She looked around her apartment again, every corner, every shadow, as if she'd find him still there, standing silently, watching. But he was gone. She didn't see it that way. To her, he was a storm she never meant to walk into. Every time he showed up at her door, the air shifted. His presence filled the room like thunder rolling low before a strike. But he never crossed the line. He never touched her, never demanded, never acted like the man she knew he was outside those walls. Instead, he listened. She would paint while he sat quietly, his phone buzzing with calls he didn't take. His men waited in black cars outside, restless, wondering what their boss was doing, wasting hours with a dying woman who smelled like turpentine and dreams. One night, she asked him why he came. He said because with her, everything slowed down. He could breathe again. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know that in the silence between them, he was falling hard and fast for something he couldn't protect. But trouble was brewing. Word had spread in the underworld. The boss was distracted. Rivals started moving. His lieutenants whispered behind closed doors. His oldest friend, Marco, cornered him one night, demanding to know what was happening. Luca didn't explain. He just warned him to stay out of it. But Marco had been with him from the beginning, through the wars, through the blood. He couldn't stay silent while his empire risked collapsing because of one woman. The next morning, Luca found a man outside her apartment, one of his own. The message was clear. They were watching her, not for protection, but leverage. He dragged the man into the alley, fury burning in his eyes. No one touched her. No one even breathed near her without his say-so. The man tried to explain it was Marco's order. Luca didn't let him finish. The sound that followed was sharp, fast, final. He stood there afterward, chest heaving, realizing just how far he'd already gone for her. That night, she saw it in his eyes, something darker than usual. She asked if he was okay, and he told her not to worry. But she did, because she wasn't blind. She knew the kind of man he was. She'd seen the look of killers before, in hospitals, in alleys. She'd seen pain that hid behind expensive suits and cold eyes. She told him she didn't need saving. He said maybe he did. Her health began to falter again. The chemo drained her, left her pale and trembling. He started sending doctors, specialists, anything money could buy. She refused some of it, telling him she didn't want to live if it meant losing what made her who she was. He didn't argue, but inside he was breaking. He'd killed men for less than the pain of watching her struggle to breathe. When she finally collapsed in her studio one night, he was there within minutes. His men didn't ask how he knew. He carried her himself, his tailored suit streaked with paint and tears. The hospital staff froze when they saw who he was, but he didn't care. He barked orders like a general, threatening, begging, doing anything to keep her alive. For the first time in years, the unshakable Luca Moretti looked terrified. She woke up hours later, her hand in his. He was sitting beside her, his tie loosened, eyes hollow. She smiled weakly, whispered that he shouldn't look so worried. He told her she scared him. She laughed, even though it hurt. She told him she'd pain again soon. He said he'd hold her to that. Days passed. He barely left her side. The doctors whispered about how much he was paying to keep her stable. His men grew uneasy. Deals were falling through, money trails shifting. Marco made another move, one Luca didn't see coming. One evening, while she was asleep, a nurse came in who didn't belong there. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the four. Luca noticed. He moved before she could blink. The syringe hit the floor, the nurse pinned against the wall, his knife glinting beneath the sterile lights. She confessed quickly. Marco's men had gotten to her. They wanted to send a message. Luca's rage was cold and absolute. That night, the streets ran red. He didn't delegate. He went himself. Every man who had touched the plan was wiped out. When he returned to the hospital, his knuckles were still stained, his eyes empty. She was awake. She looked at him and knew without asking what he'd done. She told him she didn't want that kind of love, not the kind that destroyed. He told her it was the only kind he knew. Her next painting was different. It wasn't about pain or darkness. It was of him, standing in a storm, blood on his hands, tears in his eyes, looking up toward a faint light breaking through the clouds. When he saw it, he didn't speak. He just reached out, touched the canvas, and whispered that it was the truth. But the world didn't let go easily. Marco disappeared underground. The police started sniffing around. Reporters began piecing stories together about a mysterious woman connected to a powerful man. Luca tightened security around her apartment, but she hated it, the guards, the shadows, the feeling of being caged. She told him she'd rather die free than live in fear. They fought for the first time that night. His anger was fire. Hers was quiet steel. She said he couldn't buy redemption with protection. He said she didn't understand the danger. She told him that maybe he didn't understand life. Because to her, life wasn't about power or fear. It was about moments, small and beautiful, even if they broke you. He left without another word, slamming the door hard enough to make her flinch. The silence that followed was heavy. She sat back down, took out a fresh canvas, and began to paint again. This time, not him, not herself, but the space between them. The distance that love and fear built together. For the next few days, he stayed away. His men noticed a shift. The boss was colder again, focused, ruthless, but his eyes looked dead. He'd go through the motions of command, but his mind wasn't in it. He was trapped between worlds, one that demanded blood and one that offered grace. Then came a call. A rival family had made a move, not at him, but at her. They wanted to break him where he was weakest. He was already in motion before the message ended. The convoy of black SUVs tore through the streets, engines roaring like thunder. He didn't wait for backup. He didn't plan. He just acted. When he burst into her apartment, the air was thick with smoke. She was on the floor, coughing, paint scattered around her. One of the men had a gun pointed at her. Luca didn't hesitate. The flash, the sound, everything happened at once. She screamed his name. The world spun. When the smoke cleared, the attacker was down, but so was Luca. He had taken the bullet meant for her. She crawled to him, hands trembling, pressing against the wound, her tears falling onto his shirt. He looked at her and smiled faintly, whispering that at least she was safe. She begged him not to leave. He told her to keep painting. Always. The sirens came later. The police, the medics, the chaos. His men dragged him out alive, barely, but the damage was done. She sat in the hospital again, this time holding his note in her blood-stained hands, the same words that started everything now echoing like a curse and a promise. Keep painting. Always. She didn't know if he'd survive, but she knew this: she'd never been invisible to him. Not once. And that was enough to make her pick up her brush again, even as the night closed in. The hospital corridors trembled with chaos that night. His men stood outside the ICU, armed and restless, while inside, machines breathed for him. The doctor said the bullet had missed his heart by a whisper, but the damage was brutal. She sat in the corner of his room, her hair tied up messily, his blood still on her hands. Every time his monitor beeped, she flinched. Every time a nurse entered, she looked up, terrified they'd tell her he was gone. He was the Mafia boss the world feared, but right now, he was just a broken man on a bed, pale and still, and she was the only one refusing to leave. Hours turned into days. He drifted in and out, sometimes whispering things that made no sense, sometimes calling her name like he was chasing her through a dream. She stayed, even when his men told her to go home. They didn't understand that he wasn't just another patient. He was her unfinished story, her unanswered prayer. She sat through every night, sketching him in her notebook, his scars, his hands, the soft lines of his face when he wasn't wearing his mask of power. When he finally opened his eyes fully, she was asleep beside the bed, her head resting against her arms. He stared at her for a long time, the kind of stare that carried a lifetime of things unsaid. His chest hurt when he tried to move, not just from the wound, but from something deeper: guilt, longing, confusion. He'd taken a bullet for her, but he couldn't tell if it was out of instinct or something far worse: love. The moment she realized he was awake, her breath hitched. She didn't speak at first. She just held his hand, tears spilling before she could stop them. He tried to tell her he was fine, but she shook her head, whispering that fine wasn't good enough anymore. She told him he didn't get to almost die and pretend it meant nothing. He closed his eyes again, exhausted, but those words stayed lodged in his chest like a second bullet. The days that followed were quiet, heavy with things neither of them dared to say. He recovered slowly, forcing himself out of bed before the doctors allowed it. His men brought him updates, but his mind wasn't in the business. He was thinking about her, how she looked at him now with a mix of anger and pain, how she still didn't understand what her existence had done to him. Because ever since she'd walked into his life, everything he'd built had begun to crumble. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to hate it. He couldn't stop coming back. He'd become addicted to the peace she carried in her eyes, to the way her voice softened when she spoke his name. But he also knew she was right. His world would destroy her if he didn't make a choice. One evening, she confronted him. Her body was still weak, but her voice was steady. She told him she couldn't live like this, surrounded by fear, danger, and the weight of his enemies. She said she couldn't paint with his shadows always at her door. He tried to explain that it was the only way he knew how to live, that he'd kept her safe the only way he could. But she didn't want protection anymore. She wanted freedom. Something inside him cracked. For years, he'd ruled with iron hands, taken what he wanted, crushed those who defied him. But for the first time, he felt powerless. She told him she didn't want to be his weakness. He told her she already was. He left her that night without a word. Not because he stopped caring, but because he cared too much. If she stayed near him, she'd die, and he couldn't bear that thought. So he disappeared. His men said he was handling business in Sicily, but the truth was he was hiding. From her, from himself, from what he'd become. Weeks passed. She returned to painting, pouring her grief into every canvas. Her art grew darker, sharper, filled with images of storms and shattered glass. But in every piece, there was a figure, a man standing in the distance, always watching. She didn't show them to anyone. They were too personal, too raw. Then one morning, a gallery owner knocked on her door. Someone had anonymously arranged for her paintings to be showcased at one of the city's top exhibitions. She hesitated, unsure whether to accept, but something told her this was her chance to live again, to breathe again, to honor what he'd done for her. The night of the exhibition came. She stood among strangers in elegant clothes, her body trembling from nerves. Cameras flashed. People murmured praises. Her paintings hung on the walls, glowing beneath soft light, telling stories of pain, survival, and redemption. She was talking to a journalist when a hush fell over the crowd. The doors had opened, and he walked in. Luca Moretti, alive, dressed in black, moving with the kind of presence that made the air itself hold its breath. The press whispered his name like a curse and a prayer. She froze, her pulse racing. He shouldn't have been there. He was a ghost in her world now, a reminder of everything she'd tried to move past. But he walked straight to her. No words, no hesitation, just that look, the same look from the hospital, raw and unguarded. The crowd parted instinctively, the weight of his power cutting through the room like a blade. He stopped in front of her final painting, the one she hadn't planned to display but had brought at the last moment. It was him, lying on a hospital bed, her hand clutching his, light blooming behind them. He stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then he turned to her and whispered that it was the most beautiful lie he'd ever seen. Because in her painting, he looked saved, and he didn't believe he was. She told him it wasn't a lie. It was her truth, that she'd already forgiven him, long before he'd ever asked. His expression broke then, the wall he'd spent a lifetime building crumbling in front of everyone. He reached for her hand, his grip trembling, not from fear but from everything he'd kept buried for too long. The cameras flashed, capturing a moment no one would ever fully understand. The most feared man in the city holding hands with a woman who painted his redemption. The world outside would turn it into gossip, a scandal, a legend. But inside that gallery, it was just two souls finally standing still. Later that night, they left together. He didn't say where they were going, and she didn't ask. His men followed at a distance, confused but silent. They drove through the city until the skyline disappeared, until the noise faded. He took her to the edge of the sea, where the waves crashed hard against the rocks. He said this was where it all began, where his first deal was made, where he became who he was. She asked why he'd brought her there. He said because he was done hiding, that the empire he'd built didn't mean anything if he couldn't save himself. And she was the only one who ever made him want to try. She told him redemption wasn't something he could buy or force. It was something he had to choose every day, even when it hurt. He nodded, looking out at the water, his jaw tight. Then he pulled out a small box, opened it, and inside was her first painting, the one she sold on the street the day he met her. He'd kept it, all this time. He told her it reminded him that even in the darkest places, beauty still existed. She reached out, tears spilling freely now, and whispered that maybe that was the point all along, to remind each other that broken things could still be beautiful. The night stretched between them, heavy and healing. He told her he didn't know what came next, only that he wasn't letting go this time. She smiled faintly, whispering that maybe it wasn't about holding on, but about learning to stand side by side. He took her hand again, the same hand that once shook with weakness, now steady and alive. The waves crashed louder, the sky cracked open with thunder, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them ran. Neither of them hid. They just stood there, broken, scarred, alive, ready for whatever came next. The warehouse was silent except for the faint drip of water from the cracked ceiling. Isla's heart pounded as she backed away from the corner, every step echoing against the cold concrete. Across the room, her husband, Marcus, stood with that same cold, calculating glare, his hands gripping a gun. The man she had tried to trust, her so-called protector, was now revealed as the one who had orchestrated her nightmare. "You really thought you could run from me?" Marcus sneered, his voice sharp enough to cut through steel. "All these lies, all this betrayal, and now it ends here." Isla's breath caught, but she steadied herself. She had no choice but to face him. "You're done, Marcus. I'm done being afraid." Suddenly, the doors burst open. The man sent to find her, once an enemy, now an ally, lunged forward, tackling Marcus to the ground. A chaotic struggle erupted. Isla realized that the man, David, had risked everything to save her, exposing the truth she hadn't dared to hope for. In the scuffle, Marcus's own weapon discharged accidentally. The room fell silent, the echo of the gunshot still ringing in Isla's ears. Marcus was down, restrained and defeated. Justice, finally, was not just a word. It was a living, breathing reality. Isla's knees gave way, and David caught her, steadying her trembling body. Tears streamed down her face, but they were no longer tears of fear. They were tears of relief, release, and newfound freedom. "It's over," she whispered, her voice raw but resolute. Marcus would face the law. His empire of lies crumbled. Isla, bruised but unbroken, stepped into the light outside the warehouse, the city skyline reflecting hope rather than dread. For the first time in months, she could breathe freely. She had survived, and she had reclaimed her life. Isla's courage reminded us that even in the darkest moments, truth and perseverance can triumph. No lie lasts forever, and standing up for yourself changes everything. Never let fear dictate your choices. Justice and freedom often come to those who refuse to surrender. Don't miss the next shocking story. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit share because the truth always leaves a mark.